to Tease, the podcast that cuts the property industry to the bone. We answer your questions with our expert guests and call out all the bullshit that makes the industry only slightly more popular than British politics. We are your hosts, Matt Smith.
And I'm Kris Ericsson.
And we are your proper teasers.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Properties. How you doing, Matt?
I'm very good, thanks, Kris. How are you doing?
Yeah, not bad. What's been happening since the last podcast?
Oh God, so much. I mean, I've just come back from Denmark, which I had the most brilliant time. Went to a wedding in Viborg, which is the north of Jutland. What a country!
Yeah,
spotlessly clean. You could eat off the pavement. Everything was just immaculate. It was amazing and beautiful weather. So yeah, it was very, very impressive. And then I got back to London and then back to Norbury where I live, and there was just trash everywhere. I thought, great, good. Back in London.
Yeah.
So, yeah, all good though. All good to be back.
Good. Denmark does have the highest standard of living in the world.
Yeah,
you've now seen it firsthand.
I certainly have. The food was amazing as well.
Don't talk to me about
Everyone
food.
was gorgeous. Yeah. The scenery was beautiful. I paddled in a lake which wasn't filled with sewage. Yeah, very, very good. Very good. What about you?
Well, I said don't talk about food because I've been on a 21-day detox, which has been absolute hell, but very good.
You do look good though, mate.
Thanks, mate. We're now coming up to the last 5 days or 4 days. And then I'm going to celebrate with a meter-long pizza.
And a massive binge.
A jug of beer and an ice-cold can of Coke.
Quite
because
right.
I've had no sugar, no gluten, no alcohol, no caffeine, and something else.
A fate worse than a fate worse.
Yeah,
than death.
it's
Right.
tough. Yeah,
Okay,
but
yeah.
So here we are. So today we're not going to have an interview like we did last time with Rupert. We're going to talk about some of the most important topics in the industry.
Yeah, we got a lot to discuss today.
We do. So let's crack on.
Let's just before we do, with our planned subjects, I was just nationwide have said that we are now at a tipping point with interest rates, where the one of the solutions that the government was encouraging banks to offer is switching to interest only for a certain amount of time. Nationwide are now saying that we're at a tipping point that where switching to interest only for some people between 6.25 and 6.5% will actually not make too much difference to their affordability. So we're not going to talk about interest rates because we talked about that in our first episode, and I think we'll probably have a lot to discuss on that over the next few months, certainly after the summer. But I thought I'd just mention that because that's, I think, very topical in everybody's minds. But yeah, we've got a lot to discuss. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is cladding, because this is something that's been very much in the press and in the media. And recently the Sunday Times broke a story about it. So I'm just going to read a little bit and then we can talk about it. So in the UK, manufacturers of dangerous cladding are being pursued for millions in taxpayer money spent to correct the nation's unsafe flats. This follows the revelation that some of the buildings that applied to the government's 5.1 billion repair funds were coated in flammable panels produced by companies that made false claims about their fire safety. This development brings hope to families caught in the nation building society scandal exposed after the Grenfell tragedy in 2017. Now, the report highlights that 91% of unsafe flats have not been fixed, with 660,000 people still in danger. Loopholes in government contracts allow developers to leave flammable cladding on blocks they legally agreed to repair. Meanwhile, the country's biggest freeholders have paid just 35 million to fix just a few of those blocks. But most alarmingly, the manufacturers involved in the Grenfell tragedy, including Kingspan, Arsonic, and Celotex, have yet to pay a penny to ending the crisis. And this is despite the claims that all three companies practiced frauds to the market and have made little to no effort to rectify the situation. And developers are also found to be using loopholes to avoid costs, and they are allowed to fix only what a fire expert they appoint says they should, often ignoring the advice of experts assigned by the residents or freeholders, resulting in flat owners paying high insurance bills on homes they may not be able to sell. As a result, demand for flats has cooled significantly due to the potential risks, and meanwhile, lenders and surveyors are being accused of failing to implement solutions that work in practice, further exacerbating the problem. And boy, do we know that firsthand, don't we, Kris?
Yeah, Jesus. I mean, I'm sort of lack of words here, but just what a fucking mess. We do know this firsthand because we have a wonderful client or clients who were caught in this particular position. And this is actually about 2 years ago now, where they came up to a point where they had to remortgage. Yeah. They couldn't remortgage because no bank would lend to them because they couldn't get what they call an EWS1 certificate. And I'm trying to look up what the EWS1 actually is. It's the External Wall System Fire Review Certificate. So that's a certificate it's not legally obliged to have, but it's a condition that lenders put upon lending. So it becomes sort of, in fact legal anyway, because you can't remortgage without it. That's right. And they were caught in a situation where they'd had to sort of go up on their rate that they currently had. Yeah. And this is before interest rates.
That's right. And the property was valued at zero.
At zero.
And it was a £2.5 million flat.
Wow. Desperate times. And I mean, what's most shocking here is, there's so many shocking things about this revelation. But the fact that, the government spent 1.5 billion out of 9.1 billion that they put away in funds, in grants.
Shocking.
Yeah, over a course of 9 years. I mean, that means it's going to take almost 100 years to get this fixed at this rate. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. And the fact that there's bureaucracy and loopholes so that everyone can blame each other.
That's right. Resulting in the cladding manufacturers having not paid anything.
Yeah. And I mean, these cladding manufacturers that you mentioned, Arsonic were one of them, and Celotex was the other. I mean, these are $3 billion US cladding companies.
Yeah, exactly.
And these are, juggernauts of the industry in terms of how much revenue they have. And of course, they've just pushed the buck down the road.
They really have. I mean, that flat that we mentioned earlier, the £2.5 million flat, that development, fortunately for the owners there, has now pretty much been rectified. It's been covered in scaffolding for the last few years, and they have replaced the cladding. But these are central London flats where they're worth several millions, and people have obviously actively made sure that these have become saleable again. But there are many, many people who simply do not have the resources and are trapped with expanding families in flats that are terrifyingly unsafe. I think we can all say that Michael Gove is doing his best, I think, on this to try and force this to be rectified. But as we've just mentioned, I mean, very little has actually been done because there's such a blame game going on.
I mean, it's a tricky situation because if we talk about who's at fault for this, right? You've got the manufacturers on one side producing this. You've got the developers using the material. You've got the government enforcing sort of legal obligations, and then you've got the consumer, the end user, who can also take a little bit of blame, I suspect, but very little in comparison to the other three.
Very little, because they thought what they were buying was safe because they were told it was safe, and theoretically, government guidelines had been met.
Yeah, so that's the problem, right? Yeah. Because if the manufacturer of this particular cladding material, is it referred to as K15? I think it is.
Yes.
Which is the same panels they used on the Grenfell Tower, where 72 people died in 2017. And boy, do we remember that.
Yeah.
But if the manufacturer is saying, well, you authorized us to use this material, the developers are then using that material to build it, and then the government saying, clearly it's not safe, you're going to have to pay for it. They're going to say,
but the Sunday Times are claiming that these were falsified safety certificates. And I mean, I think this is about to unfold, I think, even more, isn't it? But it doesn't help the people that are living in these properties.
No.
But then does the taxpayer, you and I, do we bail people out?
I think
this is why it keeps going around in circles.
I think this should fall on the developers and the manufacturers ultimately. I mean, particularly, it's tricky because if the government has authorized a particular material, then that's one thing, and that falls on us as taxpayers, right? But if they're falsifying documents to say that these are fire safe and they're not, it's like a Russian spy novel.
Yeah. Yeah, God.
And in between, what was the article? It said 660,000 people are still living in highly flammable, dangerous buildings.
Exactly.
The same thing that happened in Grenfell could happen again.
Can you imagine? And you're living there with your children or your elderly parents or whatever, or just yourself. I mean, frankly, shocking. Well, I mean, look, Michael Gove is trying to sort this out and has actually brought in something that is going to make a difference, certainly going forward, which is a safety bill. Now, This is the Building Safety Act, which establishes 3 new bodies: the Building Safety Regulator, the National Regulator for Construction Products, and the New Homes Ombudsman. This legislation aims to enhance building management and provide a comprehensive framework for the home building industry, encouraging more high-quality homes. Now, details of provisions of the Act will be implemented through secondary legislation. And this Act introduces new leaseholder protection measures, preventing building owners from passing the costs of historical safety defects onto leaseholders. In particular, it will prevent them from charging qualifying leaseholders for cladding removal or remediation costs. And the BSR, that's the Building Safety Regulator, will oversee safety and performance of all buildings. Now, that's something that we're going to come back to, all buildings. But just before, the New Homes Ombudsman will provide a platform for new homeowners to escalate complaints, and developers will be required to become and remain part of the scheme. I think that's great. It gives residents of high-rise buildings more control over building safety and the ability to raise concerns directly to building owners and managers who will be accountable. Again, fantastic. And it introduces a new developer tax and a levy on developers, ensuring the industry contributes to the costs of rectifying past mistakes. Fantastic.
Yeah, in theory, certainly. What happens if the developer just says, well, we don't have the revenue or not the revenue, but the profits to actually put aside to help fund the change on the cladding? What happens then? Because ultimately the people that live in these properties, as we know, right, their property value from a bank's perspective is zero until it's rectified.
Yeah.
I mean, £2 million properties, £10 million properties, £200,000, it doesn't matter. The value is zero. They have to sell. They can't sell the property. We can't sell them for them.
Right.
I mean, only if you have a cash buyer, right? Because as I said earlier, the EWS1 certificate isn't a legal requirement unless you have a lender involved.
Yeah.
But a cash buyer is going to be told by their solicitor, hang on a second, this is an unsellable asset.
Absolutely. And they shouldn't do it unless, of course, they're buying it at some insanely low value and they know that eventually they're going to get this form and, they're prepared to take a punt. But Kris, this new act is about future developments, really. But where it isn't, and you're right to bring it up, is, for example, if you're in a building that is 5 floors or more or over 11 meters, even if it doesn't have any sort of modern cladding, it can be a red brick building. You are still required now by this new act, and solicitors are just getting their heads around this because I don't think anybody really realizes that this is happening just yet. The solicitors are going to advise buyers that they need to have a certificate to say that this building is safe, whether it's got cladding in it or not, if it's over those heights, which, let's face it, a lot of properties are, even, just Victorian mansion blocks. And this is causing havoc in the flat sales industry at the moment. And I mean, we can attest to that firsthand. People do not realize that they're supposed to have this for the property that they're selling. Yeah. The managing agents are not prepared and have not got their freeholders or their share of freeholders to supply these certificates. And it's going to cause massive delays over this summer. And I think a lot of properties that perhaps would have sold this spring are not going to sell until, I would say, sometime in the autumn if they don't fall through in the current environment. Because look at where we are anyway. And this is just something, once again, that perhaps hasn't been fully thought through with the very best of intentions. Let's face it. I mean, these are good things. We need these safety measures. But boy, is it causing havoc.
Yeah, and we went to a solicitor. Well, we had a big law firm in London, a big conveyancing law firm, invited us with quite a few others to a summer party, right, in Mayfair. It was a beautiful, beautiful evening. We spoke to a lot of the sort of partners, senior partners there, and they were sort of saying they were tearing their hair out because some of these transactions that should take, on average, anywhere between sort of 4 to 12 weeks, are taking, at some cases, a year or more. Yeah, because there's so much new legislation. No one knows what's actually being put in place. No one knows how to get it.
And these are top law firms. And Kris, what they were also saying was they're actually turning down, if they can, leasehold properties because the amount of work is just insane. So, where you might have a freehold house that's worth an absolute fortune, there's much more work that will go into a, £750,000 flat. That is a real shocker.
Do leasehold houses fall under this as well? in terms of the height measurements? Because there's, large houses can easily come into those metrics, right?
If there's a leaseholder, yes, because, it's the freeholder's responsibility to provide the certificate. And therefore, somebody who's buying a lease are going to want to know that they are not going to have to pay into massive service charges in order to fix a problem that's already existing.
I was just thinking, because outside of London, freehold houses are very common in London, but outside of London, a lot of houses are leasehold.
Yeah.
So, and a standard big 4-bedroom terraced house could easily hit those metrics and then be required the same certification.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think let's make some inquiries about that. Yeah. We can confirm that next time. But I would say yes. The leasehold houses are also something that I think Mr. Gove is trying to rectify, because that's also, why buy a house that's on a lease? You want to know that you own the whole shebang, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you might as well buy a flat.
Well, I mean, this ties up nicely with several things, but one of the things is the fact that it's the whole system is so inefficient, and I think every single person we speak to, from surveyors to top lawyers, they say the same thing. It's just there's just no clarity in the industry. I mean, even for us who've been doing this for over 20 years, we still come across things now that we don't know, just like you did here with this particular sort of requirement, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing for solicitors. They don't know everything that's coming up, and legislation's happening in the background.
Exactly.
And all this extra legislation, and then you're talking about putting a developer tax and a levy on developers. Well, that means fewer developers are going to be building, and that brings us on to various other topics we're going to discuss in terms of the lack of housing being built.
Very good. Well, let's move on to the next topic.
Perfect. So the next topic we're going to discuss is holiday homes and short lets in the countryside. Now, this particular issue has been in the papers quite a bit recently, namely because Airbnb fell into this. And everyone knows Airbnb, and there's been lots of talks, particularly down in Cornwall, about the Airbnb market and whether it should be regulated. Not Airbnb itself, but short lets.
Yeah.
And this particular article raised a point. There was a member of parliament for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, and that particular area of England is the sort of northwest, and it covers the Lake District, which is one of the most iconic and beautiful spots in the country.
Yeah.
And he's raised concerns about an impending housing crisis that is impacting the local community. Now, the crisis, he says, is attributed to 3 main factors. So lack of affordable housing, which we know is true for the entire country.
Yeah.
An increase in second homes, leading to many properties remaining vacant for large parts of the year.
Yeah.
And a boom in the short-term rental sector, displacing long-term residents.
Yeah.
The housing crisis is leading to local residents being evicted and forced to leave their jobs and move many miles away. And this has come about through a 32% rise in holiday lets in that particular area post-pandemic. The MP supports the introduction of a separate planning use category for short-term lets, giving local authorities more control. The other big thing as to why these short lets and Airbnb are so popular now is because the income from holiday lets has increased by nearly 40% in the past decade, which has now surpassed the income from buy-to-let properties. And the most important part is that there are tax rules that favor holiday let investments over traditional buy-to-lets, which contributes to the shift. And if a property is available for at least 140 days a year and at least 70 days a year it's let for, then a landlord or short-term landlord can switch from council tax to business rates.
Okay.
Which is a considerable saving. So that's why a lot of people are doing it. They're thinking, well, I could rent this out for a year, or I can rent it out for 2 months of the year, charge a higher fee because of the sort of peaks in the market, and then pay business rates as opposed to council tax rates.
And also, I think a lot of landlords do this sort of thing themselves, so they don't end up paying an agency fee.
Absolutely. And so part of the problem, I mean, we'll talk more in detail about those 3 main factors, but part of the problem is that the government has absolutely no idea how many people are doing short lets because there's no control at the moment.
But are they not looking at...
They are. There is a government initiated consultation at the moment, which is going about short-term let register.
Which is supposed to be getting the results of this month, right?
This month, yeah. It was actually scheduled for June, but we're already in July as we record this. It hasn't come out yet. I had a look on the government's website, and it's a questionnaire, and you have to agree or disagree to certain things. I'm not going to go through the entire thing because it's only consultation and it's relatively boring, but the main idea being that each short-let property has to be registered with the local council or local government, whichever supersedes it, and they're given a number. And that number is then linked to the government gateway. And then the government has full sort of visibility of how many people actually doing short-term lets in this area.
And presumably you wouldn't be able to advertise your property without this number.
That's one of the ideas as well, is that you put it, I mean, they're discussing whether you put it on the website, on the online portals, but you have to have that number in. So,
and the plan is that non-compliance will be met with civil penalties.
Correct, yeah.
Well, I mean, this is not a bad thing.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing.
Although I personally love Airbnb.
As do I. Particularly during the pandemic, I was one of those 32% increases that went around England on Airbnbs.
Super spreader.
Yeah, super. Highly isolated in the water park. But yeah, so I mean, lack of affordable housing is a major issue across the entire country. And we just talked about cladding, which, talking about imposing various levies and taxes on developers, which means developers are going to build less. But I suspect, I was on a tour yesterday, as you know, with a Turkish family looking to buy a flat for their daughter, which was a very common scenario pre-pandemic, if you like. Less so now because of everything from Brexit to the pandemic itself. But and we did an extensive tour around SW8 and SW11. And that's 9 Elms for those that don't know the postcodes. And, there's 35,000 flats being built there.
Yeah.
The whole thing's a construction site now. It's been for 10 years now.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see what's coming up there, but to live there right now, might be tricky unless you're sort of facing the river
facing away from the construction.
Away from the construction. But he was saying, the problem is there's not enough. He was saying the opposite. He was saying, well, there's so much to choose from. How do I sell my apartment?
Right.
And I sort of said, well, you have to you look for something unique, something that has a real USP factor into it, right? But I was saying we don't have too much homes here. We have too few homes. The problem is that these homes, these one beds, are starting at £1 million.
Yeah, they're not affordable homes.
That's a 1% click of the world's population.
Right, that's not going to be your shop assistant or your bar manager or your nurse.
Correct.
Or your
Correct. And then who wants to build affordable housing because the profit margins are so much lower? Does the government have to build them?
Well, let's come on to that a bit later. Let's just focus a little bit more on this on the second homes in the countryside or second homes for holidays before we talk about planning and more affordable housing. But did you know, Kris, according to the English Housing Survey, 772,000 households have second homes.
Wow.
I know. And 495,000 of those are in the UK. Yeah. And the most popular areas are Cornwall, Devon, and as you said, the Lake District. And there are just not enough homes for local people. So what are the solutions to this? Because we were discussing yesterday how you can't actually build in a lot of these areas because they're areas of outstanding natural beauty. And where is personally, I think people should be able to have a second home, especially if you live in a city and you are lucky enough to be able to afford to buy something in a more rural area where you perhaps can take your children at the weekend or you can take time out of your very busy life. Where can you go where you are able to buy a property and not be ostracized or not put the local people out of the town where they grew up, went to school, know everybody, and not cause them to not be able to afford a property there? What's the solution to that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think this is one of the questions that the government's been pondering for quite a while, right? The problem is that I've just brought up on the laptop here, you can see here a map. This is a map of the UK and the green areas that are highlighted, those are greenbelt areas. So if you look at that, they're dotted around, mostly around London. There's some down in Bournemouth, but the rest of sort of southwest is empty, as is Wales.
These are greenbelt around cities. Though, but these are being outside.
These are all the greenbelt areas in the UK. Flat out.
Yeah.
And there's not that many if you look. Most of it's in Northwest.
Yeah.
And then around London.
Yeah.
But you look at Norwich, for example, I mean, there are no greenbelt areas here at all.
Yeah.
So the problem is that the reason why people sort of conjure around these greenbelt areas is because they're very close to some of the biggest cities in the UK.
That's right.
You can build anywhere you want, anywhere outside of there. The problem is there's no infrastructure. There's no towns. We're talking about central business districts. That's what the government has to do. And that means putting a lot of money into infrastructure, which Labour as a government tends to be quite good at doing, which then creates jobs, houses, opportunities, etc.
But if people are wanting to buy holiday homes in certain areas, there must be a reason for developers to build them. Because if people want to spend a certain amount of money on a holiday home, why wouldn't they buy it from a new property?
But where do you want to go? If you want to buy a holiday home in the UK, what comes to mind?
Well,
where do you want to buy?
Personally, I'm not sure I would, but I suppose somewhere like Norfolk or Devon or Cornwall or potentially even sort of Brighton, Hove, places like that. I mean, personally, I'd rather buy a holiday home in Spain, but...
As would I. But if you were to buy that in the UK, to look at this map, I mean, for most of those areas, you're actually okay. I mean, you mentioned Norfolk, that's up here. There's no restrictions there. Devon and Cornwall is slightly further down here. Bournemouth is protected through a big park.
But there's obviously, according to these statistics, the majority of people in the UK, or people who perhaps can afford, well, actually, I don't think we can say the majority, but clearly a lot of people want to buy homes in places like the Lake District, which is why these local people are being put out a bit. Well, look, I think we can now move on to what we're going to talk about then, just a moment ago, was what is the government's responsibility for building new properties, and what about working with private developers, which I think is often a trick that is missed. And now, for example, John Lewis and Waitrose has faced criticism from local councillors over its build-to-rent property ambitions. Now, the company submitted planning application for 353 flats above a Waitrose store in Bromley. This is southeast London. Obviously, we're not talking about holiday homes now, but talking about affordable housing, as part of its strategy to diversify its revenue streams amid the high street slowdown. So they're looking for another revenue stream. However, the company's plans have been deemed unacceptable by local councillors who are opposing the project because it fails to meet the town council's recommendations that 35% of units should be affordable. John Lewis Partnership has claimed that the target is unachievable due to increasing costs associated with large-scale schemes such as materials, and has requested funding from the local authority. Now, despite the company's reporting revenue of over 12 billion last year, it made a loss, Kris, of 234 million. Yeah. So Julie Ireland, Bromley's Liberal Democrat group leader, believes the retail group should be able to fund this from their own resources. She accused the company of failing to look out for the community and of showing a lack of respect. In response to this, the John Lewis Partnership stated that it will set aside properties for key workers, including nurses and teachers, and that has been working very closely with local stakeholders to meet the needs of the community. Surely there's something wrong here. If they are providing a reasonable amount of properties, and I think they absolutely should be made to meet the government's requirements of affordable housing, that's essential. But why not? Why does the government not make it easier for councils to borrow money, or for developers to have better tax incentives to build these sorts of properties? This is exactly what we need. I mean, Bromley is an incredibly well-connected part of southeast London that desperately needs to have some new housing and upmarket development. I mean, having a nice Waitrose store there with flats above it, that's got to be good for house prices and good for the area. Yeah, absolutely. But I was just curious, isn't it already law that, I mean, in terms of Waitrose getting planning permission approval, the council can set a certain percentage, right? Of how many affordable homes do you have to build in conjunction with the actual development. Bromley Council said 35%. Yeah. Surely they said, yeah, sure, we'll build 35%, and then they get their planning application approved, right? Right. So they're breaking their planning application approval requirements. Well, one would have thought so, but what they're saying is, can the council contribute so that we can have more affordable housing? And I mean, if the council is going to say outright no, are they not going to build it? Well, I mean, you'd say tear it down. Then you failed to adhere to planning applications. Well, I don't think it hasn't been built yet. So they're saying we can't afford to build it if we have to have 35% of housing, right? So if there's a collaboration, so John Lewis is stumping up the majority of the money, why doesn't the government or the council make it easier, or perhaps give them some tax breaks or grants, or
tax breaks and grants,
planning easier, or something to help them? Let's have a symbiotic relationship, because that is the only way, by working together. If the government can't afford to build the homes themselves, although I still think that we're missing a trick there. I think that the government could afford to build and sell property, because property developers do it all the time. So why can't the government build affordable housing and sell it on, or keep it as social housing? I know you disagree with me on that point.
Yeah, well,
I think they can.
I keep thinking back to Croydon Council when you talk about sort of councils getting involved in property speculation and development, because
they weren't building the properties; they were buying buildings that turned out to be duds.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it was a lot of ill-fated commercial investments that put them into a 1.3 billion debt, and they declare bankruptcy for the second time in 3 years.
Yeah. My council tax keeps going up.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing to show for it. So I just don't know if...
Filthy streets.
Yeah. I just don't know whether the government should get involved in that. They just don't seem like the best people. I mean, the government is so... misplaced and useless. They are just useless. I mean, bureaucracy everywhere. It takes a lot of planning, a lot of incentive, and you've got to be profit-minded when you're doing these developments.
Hence, what I'm saying, collaboration. But I still think they could get it right if they had the right person doing it.
And I also think John Lewis, yes, they reported a loss this year, I suspect it was, right?
I think it's been quite a few years. I mean, the high street, as we know, has been absolutely on its knees. I mean, they're closing a lot of stores, so perhaps they'll turn it around. But I think it's good that they're looking at other revenue streams, and I think that's the right way of doing it. And we need to collaborate. We need to work together. That's the way to some of these solutions. If it can't be done by one person, it can't be done by another person, but it could be done by both.
So, but I agree. The only problem then is that you have local council elections and government elections every 5 years. So you're looking at Labour. We're going to talk about Labour. Well, you're going to talk about Labour in a little bit in terms of their plans. But talking about sort of hyping up infrastructure, which was talked about earlier as well, right? But because of the state of the economy at the moment, they're going to have to put that aside and concentrating on reducing debt. By the time they've done that, they'll be out of power, or there'll be another election. And so that particular infrastructure funding, if you like, is out the window. So perhaps, and this happens every 5 years. It should almost be sort of put into the House of Lords, and it doesn't matter what party comes in, they have to follow through. That would be a better way to say this is actually, what's it called? So national law now.
According to law, exactly.
As opposed to
or even parties. Coalition governments. I mean,
well, that's the other talk.
Although that's also can make it less stable. But if there's got housing is something that we all need.
Yeah, for sure.
And how it can be, how it should change from government to government is a problem. But it does, and that's where we are. All right, Kris. Well, I think that's enough of that. Poor old John Lewis. I hope they do manage to get that built. But let's move on again.
Yep. So we're going to talk about under-resourced planning departments within the government, and that sounds like a real snooze. So we won't spend too much time on it. But effectively, what's happened here, and this all ties into what we're talking about: why aren't we building enough homes, etc., etc. So there's a law firm called CMS, and CMS is one of the 25 largest law firms in the world. So it's an international law firm. They've been in the papers recently for I say things they would rather not be. They handle quite a lot of wealthy people and governments as well. But we'll move on from that. But they did a full survey and on the housing industry in the UK. And that survey revealed that 90% of builders believe that the planning system in the UK is slowing down development. They also say that developers claim that their under-resourced planning system is delaying home constructions and deterring overseas investments. Most builders attribute these delays to a shortage of planning officers nationwide. Uncertainties surrounding the UK's planning process deter potential investors. And the other big part, of course, is that the removal of mandatory housing targets that happened last years has led to the lowest level of planning approvals since the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah. So,
these are factors that are underlying the developers when we're talking about why don't we just build more homes. The government is so inefficient in its ways. And it's just, we deal with this and we see it as well. It's paper pushing, it's waiting, for this person to sign off. in 2023, when we're talking about, how AI is going to take over the world one day, perhaps, and you and I know how easy it is to sort of scale certain things and to be very, very efficient by just changing certain processes. Here we have an industry which is, vital to the success of the country that is currently completely out of touch with the times. And the question is, what do we do about it? I mean, what sort of uncertainties in the planning process can be reduced to provide clarity to these foreign investors? Because a couple of big US investors were looking at some very big sites across the UK, and they pulled out recently because there was just too much uncertainty in the planning process.
And also, we're approaching a period where it's going to be impossible to not start talking about a change of government.
Yeah.
Joe Biden has had a meeting with Labour officials, or Labour leaders, or rather people in the Labour Party, which shows a clear sign that they're looking at the potential of a Labour government. And I think we can all say that that's very likely is going to be.
Yeah, they're just the party in waiting, aren't they?
Yeah, it's looking like it, and they've got some very big plans.
Yeah.
For planning, Kris.
Should we talk a little bit about those plans?
Yeah, okay.
Nicely.
Let's do that. So, the Labour Party is proposing a scheme to enforce the sale of land from landowners at below market value. Essentially, the intention behind this is to stimulate the construction of more houses. So Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, she's believed to be developing a plan that would change how land is valued when it's acquired through compulsory purchase orders. So currently, landowners subject to compulsory purchase orders receive what's called a hope value, which is based on the potential of their site receiving planning permission, which often results in higher prices. So Labour plans to scrap the hope value if they win the next election. And this new policy has been welcomed by affordable housing advocates, obviously,
sure.
And proponents of new town development who've been pushing for the power to acquire land at lower prices. And I think that's key, obviously, to building more affordable housing. Despite this, the proposal is obviously very likely to face opposition from landowners and even some developers. I mean, this is a law that's been in place, I think, since the 40s. So that is a pretty massive change. And according to the Centre for Progressive Policy, agricultural land worth, for example, 22,000 per hectare could be worth 6.2 million per hectare with planning permission. So that's 275 times the value. So I mean, I think a lot of landowners are going to be very unhappy.
Yeah.
But I wonder how many landowners were going to vote Labour. So they may well be able to bring this through if they get in.
Yeah, and I looked at this, and I actually don't think it's a bad idea. I'm not much for sort of government intervention anywhere. I think the markets, for most parts, are quite productive in terms of sort of finding their own equilibrium. But clearly, in this case, it's not working. And this hope value was something I didn't actually know before reading this article. I didn't realize that that's how, they sort of say, well, this is the land, but, if we were to redevelop it, it's worth X amount, and we want the difference, if you like, effectively. And so eliminating that is not a bad idea. Compulsory purchase orders scare the crap out of me.
Yeah.
I don't like them. We dealt with them, funny enough, didn't we, when the Elizabeth line, was it the Elizabeth line?
Mm-hmm.
Was being built across London?
Yeah, Crossrail.
And I remember Crossrail, that's right. And I remember selling properties in and around Soho, where I had Transport for London on the phone saying that we will buy this property, and either your client plays ball or we'll do it through compulsory purchase orders. And I thought, oh my God.
Yeah.
This was back in 2006, 6, I think it was. It just scares me. But I do get the idea.
Especially if you don't get paid out the market value.
Yeah, but it's difficult because what is the market value, right? Because the market value is perceived based on a hope value, right? So it's sort of a catch-22 because, a lot of landowners own, thousands of hectares of land across the UK. I mean, we talk about these densely populated cities, but you get on the train and you go from, London to Manchester, you'll see, plenty of unused land in areas which are, just empty.
And this is what we talked about previously is we should be developing along train lines.
Yeah.
We don't have to expand out in a circle, but there's certainly an argument for fingers because, and I'm not advocating necessarily compulsory purchase orders. although I would imagine they're only for very important reasons, such as a desperate need for housing. But land that is sitting doing nothing when there is a housing crisis you can see why the general public, I think, would be in favor of something like this.
But then that again comes back to, if Labour comes in, or should we say when Labour comes in, they're going to have to go through, they're going to have to get this voted in, right? And how long is that going to take?
Well,
how many
exactly.
consultations? How many, landowners and developers who are very wealthy, deep pockets, well-connected, are going to fight them to the death.
Absolutely, to try and get them through to a new Conservative government.
Exactly, absolutely. That's what they'll do. And then the Conservatives will come in and scrap the idea, and then we're back to no change, right? This is the problem that we keep seeing every election. Of course,
that's but I think for having a king in charge or queen.
Correct. But I think this is actually theoretically quite a good idea.
Agreed. And Labour also saying that it's a growth strategy. And this will basically bring in growth because using state power by reintroducing housing targets, building on green belts, and facilitating cheaper compulsory land purchases by the state, they are saying rises property prices and it will deter workers from moving out of areas, and that there should be growth essentially from this, and that is also hard to argue with because desperately everybody wants growth. It's not, people don't judge quality of life, they judge growth. Which is, a country's always got to be growing, and it can only be growing by immigration and by profit in house prices going up, share prices going up, companies expanding.
But that's interesting because that's a whole different problem, and we could do a whole podcast on that. But I mean, Japan famously doesn't judge its country or its progress or success on GDP, which is growth, right? It looks at so many other factors. And what's happening here in the West is that the entire Western political setup is like a capitalist economy, and it runs it like a business. And so, businesses go up and down, and so do these governments, as opposed to looking out for the people, etc. This fixation on growth within the West it's going to lead to nowhere, because companies cannot keep growing forever. People cannot. You look at it now, right? We've got a soaring inflation issue in this country. Right? Yeah. And I heard on the radio, I think it was yesterday morning, or maybe even this morning, they said that wages are going up. Yeah. They're now their highest they have been for years.
They continue to grow.
So they continue to grow. Inflation continues to spiral.
Yeah.
Right? So at what point are we going to stop inflation going up? Well, the only thing the Bank of England can do is raise interest rates. Well, we can't keep raising interest rates because the government can't pay.
They could raise VAT.
They can raise VAT, but I mean, taxing the economy is ultimately the worst thing for any government to do, right? Because that obviously slows down growth. But it's a real tricky situation, and I think we're coming to the crossroads now.
And the longer it goes on, the more people will be affected by interest rates, because of the way we borrow on mortgages in this country means that a lot of people are on fixed rate mortgages, and therefore are not being affected at the moment.
Right now,
or were very lucky to tie in just before to a 5-year fix, so they won't be affected. But people will be coming off their current mortgages, and they are going to be affected. But the inflation and that we are all suffering through at the moment shows absolutely no sign of abating.
No, and also because the way we can work nowadays, i.e. not being physical in an office, right? People can go anywhere and work. And we see this. A lot of people have now moved to sunnier places within the continent. And they work for British companies in Barcelona, in Italy, in Greece, on UK wages.
Yeah,
I mean, they must be loving it. I mean, I'm almost we're sort of kicking ourselves.
Yeah, why didn't we go to tech?
Why didn't we do something like that? But that's what's happening.
Yeah,
and they're asking for, they're coming from all parts of Europe, and asking for London wages, living in a country or a city where it's 10 times cheaper to live in.
Yeah.
So effectively they're 10 times better off, and that's the sort of brain drain that the UK is seeing. But we're going to see this staggered across, just like interest rates, right? A lot of people are still on fixed rates, and a lot of people haven't come off it yet. But as they do across the next sort of 5 years, right? Most people don't fix in for longer than 5 years. So within the next 5 years, a lot of people are going to be suffering. I mean, us included.
Yeah.
And it's going to be tough. going to be tough.
Yeah, it is. And it's not that people say, well, in that case, I'll just rent, because rental prices are also increasing. Although I would definitely say that this summer, the prime lettings market seems to be less buoyant than it was last summer. But the core market, as we've come to call it in the industry, I would say that is in London, anything below about £800 a week is absolutely booming. You know, a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom flat for anywhere between £500 and £800 a week. I mean, it's just an absolute bun fight.
Yeah. And that's because there's fewer properties to rent as well.
Well, once again, Kris, it's we talked on this. Let's not go into too much, but I mean, it's because a lot of landlords are just getting out of the industry, or they just don't want to be involved. But there's just too much bureaucracy and not enough tax incentives. And I think, again, with developers, just talking about what we were earlier, it's the same thing. That this is a place where the government should intervene with giving tax incentives to landlords like they used to be, and to developers, so that we can have more affordable housing.
I mean, that's part of the problem, and I think you've hit the nail right on there, right? Because more landlords are trying to get out because it's just not profitable for them to do this anymore, right? Which is just crazy, right? So they're evicting their tenants or waiting for their tenants to come to an end of their term, and then they put the property on the market. The property market is such with interest rates that they're going to have to take a hit. So that might not make sense either. And then the property can remain empty provided they can afford to pay for the cost of doing it, right? So you have less properties on the market, causing rental prices to go up. And that's a vicious spiral, right? If you incentivize landlords correctly, there's more properties, more choices, and prices will come down, right? And then you don't have this issue between people buying or renting or not being able to afford to do either, right? It's a real sticky situation. I sent you that LinkedIn article this morning, which I haven't gone through in detail, so we won't discuss it fully. But they were saying the same thing. I said, stop ostracizing the landlords. They're good for the economy.
Demonizing the landlords.
They're so good for the economy, and they're buying up properties. They're investing in the country.
Yeah,
they're putting money in the UK. Yeah, it's not like they're just dragging the money back, because you can't do that anymore. It's taxed here in the UK, which means more money for us.
Yeah,
for infrastructure, for all these sort of things. Yeah, what a calamity.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's touch on the market. We have been fairly busy, I would say, all things considered. Yeah. Where we speak to a lot of our colleagues on a day-to-day basis. We often work with a lot of our friends in other agencies, and I think we can all say that there are still buyers out there, very much so, because people need to move and want to move, and there's still a lot of money around in London. What's quite clear, though, is transaction levels are down. So that certainly affects us within the industry, and also affects statistics that comes out in the press, because it can often be a bit scary when you see your property sales are down by X percentage. These are quite big percentages, 20-30%.
20-30%.
But that is obviously just because less people are able to afford what they thought they would be moving into, and I think are in a wait and see mode. But it's not like the worst time ever. Properties are still trading, and we'll get through it. But what we're about to see now is we're about to go into, we're already in the school holidays. Most kids have broken up. Private schools or public schools are on holiday yet?
I think they break up they break up 2 weeks time.
Okay. Yeah. So we're at that point in the year where a lot of people will put their feet up over the summer holidays, and we will see what September brings. It's not going to bring any lower interest rates. It might probably bring higher interest rates, and I think maybe in September we'll do more about interest rates and perhaps talk to some financial experts. But what we're going to see now is the summer rush for lettings properties, which we're already in, and that will continue as it always does right through to September, October, even sometimes into November. And I would say that we are looking at a very tough sales market interest rate wise until at very least early next year.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah. But equally, for anyone who's actually thinking about buying, when the market says this is a buyer's market, that means you missed it. You've got to be quicker than that, and that's true for any sort of financial investment, right?
Yeah, missing the bottom, right?
Stock market says now's the time to buy. You missed it. You missed it already.
Well, it's a great time to buy.
Now's a great time.
Yeah,
now's a great time to buy if you got cash. Exactly.
There are some deals around.
There are, and a lot of land. I mean, yesterday, in the afternoon we saw 8 properties with 8 different agents, and every single agent said, "Oh yeah, my client's very motivated to sell." Every single one.
I bet they are.
And I had a lovely Turkish family I was out with yesterday, and he's a very senior director of a very high company in Turkey, and he was just sort of laughing at it, sort of saying, "Is there any property that's not worth buying right now?" But interestingly, I showed 2 very similar flats, and they were £250,000 apart in price. So, it's difficult for someone, for us, I can say, well, that's a realistic price. That's an unrealistic price. Yeah. Right? They're trying not to lose too much money from when they bought it, for example. But from an investor point of view, they keep thinking, well, we keep going up in price, then we keep going down in price. I don't see any difference in the size of the properties.
Yeah.
How do I make a decision?
Yeah.
So that's one problem. And then when they start, by the time they find something they like to offer, they're like, okay, so we buy this property in a week, 2 weeks?
Yeah.
No. And then we have the lawyers and everything else that comes in. And because these particular flats we looked at were new builds, we know what's coming. Do you have the EWS1 certificates? Do you have the fire regulations? Do you have this? Do you have that? And it's
that brings us, onto why people should have representation to buy, as well as to sell,
which is what we talked about with Rupert. And I think that's this is
a perfect example once again.
Yeah, this is one of the few countries that doesn't do it.
Yeah,
the buyer should 100% be represented by an industry professional.
Yeah,
who can guide them through this.
Yeah,
at the moment, I mean, yesterday I was doing that, even though they're not my client. And when I say that they're not my client, the buyer, that is, he doesn't pay my fee, so he's not my client. The client is the seller. But I should have been out talking to his advisor.
Absolutely. Or you should be his advisor.
Yeah.
Because why not? I mean, who better than to advise a buyer than people who've been selling property to buyers?
100%. But it's tricky. But I think right now, and in August, provided you can get into the apartment, that was the other thing as well, which is something that's a new trend that we haven't seen in a long time, right? Out of those 8 properties we saw yesterday afternoon, I think it was 7 of them were let out. Yeah. Which creates problems for access, because tenants don't have to give access. Some of these tenants are not in there, they're not on their sort of final 2 months. They're in there for 8
no interest
eight,
for them
months.
to show the property for sale. Just disrupts their lives.
Exactly.
If you are serious about selling a property, don't put a tenant in it.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Unfortunately, a lot of people can't afford it because we talked about this in our first podcast. Service charges have gone through the roof. Yeah. And that cost is unattainable even for the wealthier classes, if you like. It's crazy. I mean, my own service charge has gone up by over £1,000 a year. Yeah. And I'm seeing no difference. As a matter of fact, I think I'm seeing less value for money now than I was before. And then you can multiply that up as you go around, right? I mean, some of these buildings have £10,000 more service charge now than they did last year. Yeah. So what do? They rent out the flats, but they want to sell it. So they put a provision in the contract to say, if I find a buyer, you're going to have to move out in 2 months, exactly right? Yeah. And tenants don't like that. So around and around it goes. But,
yeah. Not good. Not good. Well, look, I mean, I think we'll say that if you can leave a property empty while you're trying to sell it, that is definitely the way to do it. But we can always rent it out for you if you can't. In the same way that any agent will say the same thing. I think it's all about giving the best advice and just making sure that people have covered all their bases to say, yes, you can get the income, but you can forget about selling it for a year or however long because the reality is it's not going to sell no matter, even if you put the provision in the contract. You'll be very, very lucky to have that flat looking like it would look if you lived there, or if it was dressed for a sale. In all likelihood, it's going to be clothes all over the place, food all over the kitchen, very hard to get in. That one buyer will be in town and you'll miss that viewing. Yeah. It's how many times have we seen that happen?
Yeah,
again and again. Well, look, I think there is a lot to be positive about, Kris. There are buyers who are able to pick up good deals
for sure.
and there is a lot of incentive to get interest rates down. And I think everyone's going to be in the government doing their damnedest to do that. And hopefully banks will be lenient with people who are unable to pay their mortgages. We're all going to enjoy a few weeks of lovely summer holidays and come back strong in September.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just talking about those 2 points before we close off, I think banks will have to become lenient, because you and I discussed this the other day. Banks don't want to be sitting with a portfolio of distressed properties.
Because who's going to buy them?
Who's going to buy them? Yeah. And they don't want their asset on their books either. It doesn't make any sense, particularly not if that asset is declining in value. So they're going to have to become lenient. Yeah, they will be.
Yeah, and also in the age of social media, people don't want my house has just been repossessed by X bank.
Correct. That which is almost a more vital point that you've just mentioned there as well. And then I think regardless of interest rates, people always adapt eventually. When there's a lot of upheaval, what do people do? They sit back on the fences and wait for it to calm down. Yeah, which is more or less where we are right now. Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of that cycle, which is why I'm saying now's the time to buy, because come September, it might not be the same situation. Yeah, because once there's some clarity, when people think, oh, actually interest rates aren't going to go up. Okay,
well, I think once they stop going up, and they settle, or once perhaps, Kris, we might even say once they stop coming down. Yeah. Like if they go up maybe a couple more times, which they probably will, and then at some point they're going to come down a little bit. And when they sort of stabilize, or banks are offering a little bit higher or a little bit lower, that's when we'll start to people say, okay, this is what interest rates are going to be like, because these are not ridiculous interest rates. Let's face it, they're not. But what people have to do is adjust their expectations of what they can afford to buy, and that's that. Yeah. You are no longer going to be able to buy that house at £2 million. You're going to have to buy a house at £1.5 million. Yeah. And either property prices will adjust so that there are more buyers in that bracket, or people are just going to have to buy something with one less bedroom, or not as big a garden, or no off-street parking, or et cetera, et cetera.
It'll be interesting, and I'll ask you for your prediction here then, since you mentioned that. When stamp duty went from 5%, the top bracket, to 7%. Yeah. It's moved several times since then. It's a lot higher now. But when it went from 5 to 7, it was the £2 million mark. Mm-hmm. Remember?
I do.
How many people bought properties at £2 million? A lot of that were investor visas. There was a requirement to put money into the country to get a visa. But 2 million. If you were on a 2.5 or 2.25, you had to go down to 1.999 to sell it.
You did.
It set that limit. So it killed off £500,000.
It did. It just wiped it off the value of those homes. Yeah.
So what do you think is going to happen now then?
I think that there is no question that property prices are going to drop because they are simply not going to be enough buyers around. I don't think they're going to drop for that can afford them. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're going to drop by very much, but I think they will certainly have to compensate. I would say, for example, just to give it maybe make it more real that people can understand. I'd say if a property was £3 million, I would say it'd probably end up selling at 3.695.
If it was 4 million.
Sorry, if it was £4 million, we'd end up getting 3.695. Yeah. So that kind of figure, I think that's what we'll see an adjustment. If something was going to sell at £2 million, I'd say it'd be selling at 1.85. Okay. Right. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, if that happens, that's not too bad, I guess. The thing about property prices dropping in the UK is that this is the second time in our careers that we're working through a very, very challenging period of time, and the likelihood of us going into recession seems to be quite high, etc. But 2008 was that sort of boom moment when everything stopped. Did we see property prices drop in 2008? Not really. There was an initial
they dropped for 6 months for distressed sellers.
100%, right? But the average person just said, well, I'll just sit back, rent it out, and pull back. And then what happened at the end of 2019, which was about 18 months after the financial crisis, property prices were trading at a higher price than they were pre-2008. So it didn't take long.
Wait, your dates were wrong there. 2019, you said?
2009, I meant.
9, right, yeah.
So 18 months after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, prices were higher than they were.
They were, but the interest rates had dropped to very, very low, very, very low. And we're in a very different situation now.
But I guess the point...
Very high prices and very high interest rates. People literally can't afford it.
Yeah. I struggle to see people taking that sort of loss.
It depends what they bought it for. Yeah. If they're selling at 2 million and they end up taking 1.85, but they paid 1.2.
Well, no, that's fair enough.
Happy day.
That's fair enough.
A lot of people are sitting on property they've had for years.
Yeah, and we have clients that have have had to take that very difficult decision where they paid 1.5 and I'm to sell at 1.2 or less, right? So
yeah, well, that's a much less favorable situation.
It is, but I don't think we're going to see much of that. I think you're right. Those that have sat there on their properties for a while and sort of geared up on capital appreciation, they'll still sell at a profit.
Yeah, and eventually they'll go back up because they always do.
Yeah, there we are.
Kris, we've got to go because we're out of time. Thanks, everybody. That's a toodaloo from me.
And a hey-do from me.